I'd like to thank Lon Huber for joining us today at Duke Energy to talk a little bit about some innovative rate design and innovative strategy they're doing at Duke. So to start off, Lon, could you share really what you're thinking for the future of rate design and any innovation that you're working on today?
Yeah, well, we've got a lot going on. One of the recent approvals that we got unanimously, actually, from the South Carolina Commission was a whole new set of tariffs for rooftop solar. And those tariffs introduced dynamic pricing, static time of use periods, and a few other, pretty industry-leading innovations around minimum bill, grid access fees, and so forth. So that we're pretty proud of that. And there's also actually a link to DSM in those rates. So there's demand response that's incorporated. So we're pretty proud of that one. And then we recently filed for an electric vehicle tariff, a new type of infrastructure tariff that allows the customer to participate in the EV revolution without having to pay high upfront costs. So it's basically a type of subscription essentially for EV charging equipment. So that's another one. We're looking to add some demand response and other types of price signals to that. And then we're actually in launch mode for a very large community solar program. It'll be, one of the top 5 largest community solar programs in the country. Probably third, but we'll see what else is people are doing. But this one, customers can subscribe. They get a bill credit. They get a subscription charge, and it links clean energy and the renewable energy credits to them. So that's going to be launching pretty soon. That's going to be right around 749 megawatts. So a lot of fun things happening in different states, all hitting the themes of decarbonization, customer centricity, and then some types of dynamic control so that we can deploy these assets to the benefit of the grid as more and more extreme weather hits, and as more and more intermittency in generation comes online.
That's great. One add-on here, could you just expand a bit more about the variability in the pricing that you mentioned for that solar tariff, I believe?
Yeah. So, a big thing that we're facing in the Carolinas is a winter peak. And a winter peak is a little bit harder to predict than a summer peak at times. Typically, you see this during the polar vortex-like events, right? And so what we have in the rate design is basically a call signal that says, hey, this is going to be one of these extreme, cold days. It's usually going to be in the winter morning. And so then we can look at our forecasts and give the customer heads up, hey, this is going to be a peak day, and their prices for those peak hours are going to increase pretty substantially. So that sends a signal to the customer, hey, reduce your load, adjust the thermostat and so forth. And a few of the events will actually help control that thermostat for them, do some preheating so that they don't notice that we're actually having some control to redo their set points a little bit to handle that extreme weather.
So how do you incorporate data into your decision-making processes at Duke?
Yeah, we're very data-driven. In fact, we are using AMI like never before in a comprehensive rate review. It's going to be really the first in its country. It is really unpacking all of our rate designs, overlaying vast amounts of data from demographics to, like I was mentioned before, AMI, to uncover cross-subsidizations, to uncover opportunities for more savings for EEDSM program, looking at how well rates align to cost causation. So we're pretty proud of this undertaking. Has a lot of stakeholders involved. We have a lot of working groups, and data basically informs and will inform that whole process. So we launched a few months ago, and we're just starting to get really into it, understanding customer clusters of high users, low users, winter peak users, summer peak, and so forth. So yeah, we heavily rely on data to guide us through our rate design process.
That's really exciting. Can you share any insights you've already determined? For example, maybe like a high summer user?
Yeah, it's interesting the difference between all electric and gas customers, and also single family homes that have high income versus low income. And typically, a lot of folks think, well, if you're low income, you're low usage, you're not using as much. But actually, for low income single family homes, they use more than the average customer, right? Or it's very close in certain circumstances. So you can't really distinguish income and usage level. So that was an interesting finding. Also, mobile homes having very high peak demand during certain time periods. But yeah, there was the obvious of when you're gas heating, you don't have that winter peak, but they actually had a higher summer peak than all electric. So it was sort of interesting how these all sort of work together and the little nuances and apartment dwellers versus single family and so forth.
Can you tell me how decarbonization goals or net zero goals might come into play with rates? Would you ever consider like a clean or dirty signal or GHG implications?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that rates can do to help meet our decarbonization goals. One of the things that we did in designing new time of use rates is we looked at something called the net peak. And the net peak is essentially where our fossil peak is during the day and hourly during the year and so forth. And so our peak times in the time of use rate specifically sharpshoot that period. And so you basically treat large-scale renewables as load reducers in trying to identify that time period. It also aligns very nicely with our loss of load probability hours that we see from the planning team. And so we're able to really send that signal that, hey, these are the high carbon times, which also are the high cost times. Because as we know, renewables are zero marginal cost, right? On the margin, obviously there's upfront investment. And that's the other key part of this, which is how do you send price signals for fixed infrastructure, right? You put solar in, well, how do you recover that? Is it all volumetric, even though it's fixed infrastructure? So we need to think through how we structure our rates to align with the benefits, but also the challenges of carbon-free energy. And so we're thinking through different ways to do that, but in a customer-friendly way. There's the other point about sending dynamic price signals, because you can't always predict Mother Nature, right? So you need these tools to say, hey, this is a critical peak day or critical peak time. There's a cloud front overhead or extreme weather event that we've got to prepare for, and we're going to send you price signals to help get the customer aligned with beneficial grid behavior.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Can you tell me, do you think that like residential consumers would be ready for those price signals, or would that be more focused on a smaller medium business or CNI customer?
Yeah. So what we're finding is actually the small business sectors, some of the hardest to actually reach and adapt to some of these prices. The larger guys are pretty sophisticated, depending on what type of operation they have, whether it's manufacturing or data center. So there's different responses that they can bring to the system. In terms of residential customers, it's a mixed bag. We all know that that customers aren't the same, right? And so we find some that are enthusiasts for these more complex price signals, and then other ones that maybe it's not for them. And so we're piloting rate designs that are actually for the households that really don't want that type of exposure. So we can control certain load sources in their home and send them a price signal that is based on their flexibility in general, rather than the response to a particular event. And so basically they can come to us and say, hey, it's okay, to adjust my thermostat 2 degrees in either direction. And then I'll give them a deal on their monthly bill, for instance, right? So I'll say, all right, normally you pay $100 on average every month. I'll lock that in for you as long as you allow me to adjust your thermostat to 2 or 3 degrees, maybe an extra discount if you give me more degrees of freedom, right? So those are the types of things that we're piloting right now. We're also piloting peak time rebates. And so those are really, it's more of a carrot approach Customer responds, they get savings. If they don't, they're held harmless. I think it's going to take an all the above approach, honestly. I would argue that probably most customers are in the camp of the bill certainty products and the peak time rebates, most likely, than the more aggressive price signals. But it remains to be seen. And some customers, like customers that go solar, they're putting generation on the rooftops. They're more in sync with their energy, and they are more enthusiastic about possibly adopting these more dynamic price signals.
So what do you think about distributed energy resources, specifically electric vehicles, and how soon they might impact the load shapes?
Yeah, well, they're already starting to impact load shapes, especially from distributed solar. And EVs are growing every quarter. I think we're up 176% in registrations compared to last year. So we're starting to see that on our system, and we are actually quite proud that we just finished a assessment of our grid in the Carolinas, a 10-year forecast hourly of the local distribution system, and baked into that our forecast for rooftop solar and electric vehicles. So we're gaining more and more knowledge about how these resources impact the grid, both the bulk system and the distribution level system. And so that can help us create some programs for control. Maybe it's smart inverters, battery storage, controlled EV charging, even vehicle to home. And so, yeah, it's still a little bit early on. And so what we're doing, in addition to getting all that data in those forecasts, is setting up those rate designs to make sure that we're targeting the right hours and we're encouraging load building when it's most appropriate and can help the system. And usually by helping the system, you're increasing utilization of clean resources. So it's really a win-win.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, would you consider strategically load building, like you're saying, in the right times, but also in the right places? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the work that some of my analytics teams are really doing right now. It's sort of taking those circuit level forecasts and then figuring out how can we optimize DERs to meet a specific constraint on a segment, right? And so that's sort of the new frontier, if you will. We're working on how well certain load shapes of measures align with the shape of the capacity constraint. But there's a lot of complexity because as you defer traditional upgrades, you have to make sure what you're replacing it with is there and there when you need it. And that's where it gets a little bit tricky, especially with intermittency. So we're looking to try to firm up a base of maybe intermittent renewables with something more dispatchable. And that can be types of DR, it can be batteries, things of that nature.
That makes sense. In the future, where DERs and EVs are everywhere, do you think you will use rates as a strategic mechanism to balance that equation?
Yeah, I think we'll have to, honestly. In the past, it was a bit of a simpler equation. It was dispatchable centralized generation meeting variable load, right? But now we actually have variable load and variable generation, all to try to balance. And then you factor in local resources, and now you've got even more complexity. So price signals are an absolute must. I think where we have to move to is a type of two-way pricing mechanism. And we've heard a lot in the past about two-way power flows on the distribution system, right? But I like to talk about two-way price signals. I'd like to understand from customers where their tolerances are so I can get the best deal for resources deep in the grid edge. And so that's a little bit different than from today in a lot of states where you have just a fixed compensation rate for DER resources, which is typically what your retail rate is. And the retail rate has been lagging in innovation because of the lack of metering and billing systems. Well, that's all changing. And it's changing for us as we implement our new billing system to match the capabilities of all of our new AMI meters. So now we can send better price signals. And so it's more than just me sending those. I like to get some feedback and say, and communicate to devices and almost have a type of bidding structure, if you will, where resources can participate and we can do some price discovery so we can make sure we're getting the best bang for the buck from all these resources down in the distribution system. Similar to how we do bulk resources, right? We have competitive solicitations and we try to get the best deal for ratepayers. Because at the end of the day, we want to decarbonize, but do so in a way has a light impact on customer bills. And so you want to look at the dollars that you're paying per ton of CO2 emissions. And you're not going to get that if you just send static rates that are decoupled from competition or from the actual cost of these resources. And so that's really where things are headed. Have some competition between DER devices on the grid edge. Let's get the best deal and make sure that we're decarbonizing in a way that is affordable to everyone.
So I'm curious, in the future, when there's all of these complexities, do you foresee a lot more rates, and do you foresee a lot more changes happening from day to day in rate structures?
Yeah, great question. I do think we're going to have more rate offerings than in the past, but I don't think it's going to be overwhelming. I think it's going to be options that are targeted for all the main customer demographics out there that balance customer goals, say around sustainability, around control, risk, price exposure, and we really have a menu for customers to choose from. I think the key thing is to make sure that these rates are somewhat scalable and dynamic, and someone has to see the dynamic price signals. Whether that's the customer, it's up to them, or whether that's us, and then we can optimize around the customer preferences. And so I think that we can avoid having the situation where it's like, oh, we have to update the rate design. It's been a year again or 3 years. I think we can create rate designs that are pretty durable and lasting 5, maybe 10 years because we have dynamic price signals actually in the rate, and we forecast forward what the peak time periods will be. So our recent TOU filings in North Carolina that are really geared towards electric vehicles and rooftop solar, we actually modeled years in advance where that net peak will be, where at the highest carbon intensity. And so, we're still balancing today's numbers, of course, but we modeled out into the future so that we could select those time periods that would be pretty long lasting. And then again, we incorporated dynamic price signal in there as well that we can call outside of those peak windows in case there's ever a misalignment. So that's one example of a rate design that's durable. But again, those price signals are facing the customer, right? And so I want to have those other rates where the utility, we're the ones optimizing, and we can actually get much more complicated than an all volumetric time of use rate. We can start incorporating demand-based price signals and so forth, and peak prediction of when system peaks will occur and so forth. So we can get more and more complex on our end without the customer really seeing it, as long as we have some control over certain load sources and so forth. And so I think it's very similar to how customers interface with Verizon or Netflix. That's a fixed infrastructure system that has peaks that those companies need to control. They don't bring the customer in on that control. You don't say, hey, can you not watch, the Queen's Gambit right now because everyone is watching Netflix, right? You don't see that, or we're going to degrade your quality here. And Verizon does different things as well to manage and create a good customer experience. So those types of pricing programs can easily adapt because the customer doesn't see those, the utility does, and we're optimizing around those as they change.
Perfect. Welcome back, everybody. Fantastic session just now from Lon Huber, Vice President of Rate Design and Strategic Solutions at Duke Energy, who has joined me for our second live Q&A. Again, I'll remind everyone, you have the ability to ask questions in the prompt at right. We will work to make sure that we ask them to Lon here in real time. But why don't we get started? Lon, thank you again for joining us. Wonderful to have you.
You bet. Yeah. Thanks for inviting me to speak.
Perfect. So, in your session, you mentioned that the solar tariff was a unanimous decision in South Carolina. That's fantastic, obviously. How did you build such a strong case for that?
Yeah, well, of course, it starts with having a good team around you, right? Everything from legal staff to some of the technical folks on board. I think it was a mix of things. One, we really did use best practices from around the country, and then some really sort of path-breaking additions to it. The most important thing is those path-breaking additions weren't that far sort of out of the box. They were natural build-ons to existing commission policy, just natural extensions. So we didn't really push the envelope, too far. But at the same time, we really did bring together something that has never been all packaged before. Mixing the critical peak with the TOU, the DR, and all of those other rate elements. And then, obviously analytics showing that these rates with using actual customer data and production, address that cross subsidy. And we looked at the cross subsidy in two different lenses, right? The embedded historical investment lens and the marginal future lens. So that was, that was a lot of analytics, thousands of customers and their data crunched through these models to show the commission, within reasonableness. And we try to be as conservative as we could that, hey, this gets rid of 90+% of the subsidy.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And I'm going to ask more definitely about the data crunching that went into that. But before I do, sticking on that idea of sort of the regulatory view of things, do you see any pushback from them in terms of getting to advance rates, whether that's a bit of that two-way pricing system you've described? Are there pushback from them, as well as, when you think about it from the Duke side of the fence, what technical hurdles do you have to get over to get there?
Well, there's a lot of steps before we get to that, that vision on more and more of like the true, two-way side of things. But, in general, what I would, and what I see out there is that a lot of customers don't want to be exposed to pretty advanced price signals, right? They've got a lot of other things to spend their mental bandwidth on, and they're pretty risk adverse. So they could save all year and have a really bad event in the winter and still save all year, right? Like net, still have savings, but that one really high month put a bad taste in their mouth, and they don't want anything to do with it, right? So I think there's it's more customer related. Obviously, the billing system has to be capable of doing it, but the programs that we've put out so far, they've been accepted by regulators and others, from the peak time rebates to the variable CPPs, and a lot of it's been framed in pilots as well, right? So it's not like we're going out there and say, hey, put customers mandatory, on these rates. And so I think that's a discussion down the road. But in general, I see the issue just being, the more granular you get, the more realistic the pricing is to the system. I think the more it conflicts with the majority of customers that might not want to really monitor that or have some, risk aversion.
Yeah, and that's actually a really good, jumping off point to this idea that data tells us a ton, right? But obviously data doesn't lie. But then you get into, say, a customer interview or a customer sort of feedback loop. How do you work with customers either in advance of these types of ideas or in more of a real-time implementation stance to understand what you're saying, which is, I just don't have the mental bandwidth to think about my energy in 15-minute increments, right? So are you also using data that's more qualitative, I guess, to support your designs?
Yeah. So, for the DSM, DR element to the South Carolina solar program, and we're still working this through the commission. I had testimony due today, actually. So that's the rings around my eyes. But there, we surveyed 20,000 South Carolina customers, get a general feel of where things were at. Only, I think, about 13% actually opposed it, right? So I think 53% supported, and then there's a big chunk of uncertainties. And then from there, you really want to dive into that. So then we had focus groups on the qualitative side of things to really dive into it. Hey, what are you what are you thinking about? What are you uncertain about? What are the questions? And, we found that, no surprise that there's a good group of customers that don't even know we're regulated, right? They don't even, there's some basic things that are just
what is a kilowatt hour group? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. We didn't even go there. It's just, and, so there's a lot to catch customers up on to basically ultimately put forward the question, hey, are you willing to spend a little bit of money now for, to save money down the road, right? And it's this trade-off. But, with everything with DR, you have to pass cost effectiveness tests. And at the heart of it, it is hey, are the costs greater than the benefits? And so there's a time horizon there and so forth. And so some of the customers picked it up, but that's where we really get insights and understand how much customers are looking at their bill, how much they want to devote to different things, and are they comfortable with technology leading it and us helping with that automation or not, right? A lot of customers, it depends on the wording you use. If we say, hey, will you allow the utility to control your thermostat a few times a year, they'll say no. Right. But if you say, are you willing to let the utility help automate your thermostat response to events, they'll be like, of course. So it's
it's an interesting paradigm between what the data tells us and what the customers tell us. In terms of the data itself, though, I mean, you've got a good analytics team at Duke. You also use some third-party sources. We've worked with Duke over the years. Where do you draw the line in terms of where you start that analysis and where that analysis ends, right? How many segments do you need to analyze? When do you reach a diminishing marginal return on that sort of analysis process into getting to where you need to answer the question you've put forth, I guess?
Yeah. It really depends on, the particular case and everything. But, in general, I think we see around, I try to aim for the 80-20 rule as much as possible, right? And when we dive into it on the residential side, there's sort of 8 main clusters that represent about 80%. So that gives us a really good starting point to figure out, okay, where are most of the customers at? And then, you just really want to make sure that you've got a decent depth of that data as you start to get to those tails, right? It's not a weird, there's no weird anomalies, you've got COVID now that throws off some of the data, but I try to do that 80-20 rule. And actually sometimes when things get really, really advanced, and I'm talking only a few people can understand the model, it's so big. I actually have a red team that creates a really more basic model and see how close they are together and see where the differences are and have the team troubleshoot that way.
The bottoms up, meet in the middle approach.
Exactly.
I like that. So sort of a parting question, and you were talking about menus you give customers, but I'm going to give you sort of the unlimited menu. Is there any particular piece or pieces of data or analytics that you don't currently have today that you think would be a game changer for the rate design work that you're doing?
Oh, wow.
I'm only giving you 30 seconds on it.
Yeah, I would say as accurate demographic data as possible. And because I've already got the load data, I've got records of customers signing up to different products and services, calling in a call center and so forth, but we don't collect personal information on customers, right? And so, we have some data that fills in all those demographics, but I want even greater accuracy to understand propensities and so forth. So that's what I would say.
Perfect. The parcel picture needs to be completed. Thank you, Lon. Appreciate your time. For those of you still listening, on to the next session. Please click through.